Good morning. My name is Cheryl Proval. As VP of Publishing for Imaging Biz, I'm delighted that you've joined us for a presentation on a subject of great importance to today's radiology practices. Keep your hospital relationships healthy, strategies for every practice, sponsored by medical management professionals. MMP is a leading provider of billing and practice management services to radiology groups and imaging centers. It currently serves more than 150 radiology practices with more than 1,700 radiologists combined throughout the U.S. We're fortunate to have two veterans of practice-hospital relations as our presenters, Randall Rote, Vice President of Radiology with MMP, and George Earhart, Director of Practice Management, also with MMP. The presentation should last approximately 1 hour. Please feel free to type in any questions you may have at any time throughout the webcast via the question submittal section located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that your questions will be addressed at the end of the webcast. If we're not able to address your question in the time allocated, we will respond via email to you directly. If you need technical assistance during the webcast, please dial 1-866-297-6395. It is now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Randall Rote and George Earhart.
Thanks, Cheryl. This is Randy Rote, and on behalf of George and I, we're very happy to be here today sharing some of our experiences and insights to this important topic. The presentation today will be broken down loosely into two parts. First will be the background, kind of a 30,000-foot view, and then leading into and culminating with some practical portion of the presentation. Throughout the presentation, as we go through the various issues, both George and I may be commenting on various slides. The agenda for today, we want to cover a little bit about the current climate, what we're seeing in the marketplace, what we see and interpret as radiology market trends, take a brief visit to the radiology practice models we're seeing employed in the industry, and then focus more on the radiology hospital relationships and collaboration strategies. A quick look at some of the headlines going in the current news, and I don't think these will be new to anyone, but they do paint some interesting trends. We're seeing new competitors. We're seeing new radiology business models. We're seeing instances of significant contract losses, and these are significant and long-term contracts that have been in place for many years. We're seeing the hospitals looking at other alternatives for delivery of radiology services. Some of the governmental activity that we're seeing, and we're seeing a plethora of governmental activity going on right now. Much relates to SGR cuts and new legislation coming through, it's called PPAC, or the new healthcare initiatives. And I'm just going to run through a few of our information that we send out to our clients. And kind of the main point of this, aside from the specifics, is the sheer volume of this correspondence. These e-updates are only sent out in cases where they're highly relevant and very important. So far this year, all of these e-updates have gone out within the first 6 months of this year, which is pretty abnormal compared to prior years. To summarize the radiology market trends we're seeing, increasing competition, increased hospital focus on non-traditional options, increasing regulations, inconsistent application and funding problems tied to these regulations, We're seeing tightening cash flow for both hospitals and groups. And we are noticing what might be the start of a trend to maybe redirect imaging from imaging centers back to facilities. I would like to say that as we prepared this information today, there is a lot of information. There are a lot of folks that have written great articles on this. We do have at the end of the presentation a reference slide for more resources that you can go to. And in the wisdom of Confucius, we are merely passing on the wisdom of others who have gone before. So I think these trends really beg the question, is there a case for re-engineering the radiology practice model? We've heard a lot of questions like this throughout the marketplace, and people wondering what the future of independent radiology practices are. First and foremost, does size matter? Do I have to get bigger in order to compete? Does our corporate infrastructure support the type of needs that the hospitals have going forward? How does this affect our relationship with the hospitals? And finally, what type of attitudes do we have, what type of perceptions do we have about where we fit and what our role is in the radiology service delivery? I'd like to take a minute and just kind of go back to revisit some of the common hospital models that we're seeing. We're seeing independent radiology groups that have exclusive contracts. We're seeing independent radiology groups that have no contracts. We're seeing groups that service primarily imaging facilities, service or own. We're seeing non-exclusive contracts. Some groups have medical and administrative contracts, and some groups are employed by the hospital. What I'd like to do now is take just a minute and kind of do a deep dive on the structure of the independent radiology practice as compared to a traditional business model. And I think what this does is exposes some areas and identifies some differences that go to the relationship. So if we take a look first at the ownership. Basically, in a radiology practice, we're seeing PCs, PLLCs, et cetera. Notably, the owners are the operators. So the owners are the frontline folks that take care of the service delivery. As opposed to a traditional business model, corporations, C Corps, LLCs, Sub-S, that are traditionally have owners that manage the operators, and there's a very distinct employer-employee relationship. If we look at the purpose, typically physicians, radiologists, like other professionals, band together in group practices to meet a couple of needs, primarily to serve the professionals, sharing of overhead, contracting, providing some coverage, definitely sharing administrative expenses, and creating an opportunity for professional knowledge and sharing. The purpose of a traditional business model is quite simply to serve the client and increase shareholder value. Another notable difference is the location. Our radiology group practices, typically in a hospital setting, are located on-site at the hospital. The traditional business models tend to have remote locations. Where do we receive payment? Typically, a radiology practice will receive payment for their services from a patient or a third party, whether that be government or insurance. In a traditional business model, you typically receive payment from the contract holder. And who do we report to? Radiology practice, I think we all know we report primarily to ourselves, to the hospitals, patients, insurers, governments. We have a number of folks that we report to. In a typical business model, a contract holder will typically report to, or the contractor will typically report to a contract holder or with some reporting responsibilities to its shareholders. Now, if we take a look at the strengths and weaknesses, and quite frankly, we are of the opinion that the group practice has a number of strengths that in many ways make it the primary mechanism to deliver radiology services through hospitals. It certainly has some weaknesses, and I think the challenge that we have today in this environment is that we need to take a good introspective look at these strengths and weaknesses and see if we can realign our interests to meet the current and future needs of radiology. So first, the strengths. Certainly the owners are intuitively connected to the service offering. There's a consistency of group excellence. They're clinically driven. There's an ownership of quality, a high degree of control, and an opportunity for professional innovation. If we take a look at some of the weaknesses, and these are certainly not going to be new to anyone on this call, these groups can be fatally democratic. There can be lethargy and inconsistency in decision making. Perhaps one of the biggest is multiple voices and message confusion. How many times have we sat down at a group practice meeting, come up with a decision only to have one of the partners talking to the chief executive of the hospital and send a completely different message? In these instances, the client has an opportunity to see our dirty laundry. It's hard to remove bad actors, and it's hard to manage colleagues to consistently drive quality and messaging. So the question is, how can a group practice model effectively support this new relationship that we're seeing evolve in the radiology specialty? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that our motivations, our goals, the broader goals are aligned. We need to make sure that our governance structure, our command and control structure, if you will, is able to handle the delivery of what both the patients and the hospitals are looking for going forward. We really need to tighten up our communication and get control over the communication and our messaging. All of these go to the relationship management. And ultimately, our partners that we contract with need to know that we have control of the deliverables and we have control of the people in our practice that are delivering those services. We're seeing a lot of competition in the marketplace, and the tenor of the competition that we're seeing, the tenor of the story is this. Basically, we have teleradiology models, we have national radiology groups, we have employed physicians, and all of those within the context of a business relationship are making compelling arguments. Basically saying that the model being offered is as good or better from a relationship standpoint than a radiology group practice model. I don't know that we've seen a lot of instances where the clinical deliverable is definitely superior, but we have seen instances that were on the previous slides where contracts are lost primarily because of relationship issues. So what are the wants and needs in a hospital relationship? Well, the hospital wants no customer service complaints. They want improved service levels. They want quality, consistency, performance standards, subspecialization, increased coverage hours, more radiologists to handle the volume. And again, I don't think any of these will be a surprise to anyone on this call. Typically, we hear that a radiology group wants to maintain incomes, improve exclusivity clauses, be more competitive in recruiting, technical ownership, and Nighthawk coverage, reduced weekend coverage call, vacation levels, and I don't know that it was Freudian that maintain incomes is on there twice, but certainly that's a story that we hear. What this presents, I think, if you look at those two side by side, is a relationship disconnect. The hospital seems to want things that are centered around service and accountability, while the physicians are looking for issues centered around income, contract security, and lifestyle. We don't appear to be answering the same question, and certainly within the context of these two comparatives, the goals are not aligned. We think that it is vitally important that someone at the high level of the radiology group needs to recognize and bridge the gap to maintain these relationships. Now, fortunately, we do have a lot of common ground to work with. We are on the same side of the table with respect to patient service, hospital viability and strategic direction. Certainly, we're on the same page with respect to the success of the hospital because our radiology groups are to a degree linked at the hip. And some of the things that we're seeing that are very helpful in this is participation on important committees, being at the table with the decision makers in the hospital so that we are actually a part of the decision, a part of the solution, as opposed to an independent bystander. Technology is an area of common ground. Leadership of the radiology department. I think that most hospitals would certainly value our input and the radiology department leadership. And just quite frankly, being a part of the local community given the intimacy of the services that we deliver. So what's your role in the process? And this one really goes to attitude and perception. And I think that to a large extent the radiology leaders in our industry or in the groups understand the competitive dynamics, they understand the service that's needed. But as a whole, how do our groups really look at our relationship with the hospital? Is it a case of, we're the radiologists and the hospitals should be here to serve us? Is it a case of we have a contract with the hospital, so we are here simply to serve the needs of the hospital? Is it a case, and obviously this certainly is the preferred answer, do the radiologists and the hospital collaboratively serve the patients and the referring physician? And I think what we need to do is really look at our roles from the perspective of the leaders in the radiology groups to the most non-leader physician in the radiology group, and make sure that our understanding of this role and our relationship is clearly defined and that we're all marching to the same drummer. Many times the pendulum will swing, as with any relationship. But ultimately the question is, are we on the same team and are we committed? Now, I want to take just a brief minute and talk a little bit about contracting. There is a plethora of information out here on contracting, so I am not going to address it in that level of detail, but rather from a 30,000-foot view. First of all, contracting is by definition a process of conflict resolution and finding common ground. It can be an ugly process. It's certainly a detailed and focused process. The hospital-radiologist relationship many times provides no insulation, particularly when you have the radiologists negotiating their own contracts with the hospital. There's not a lot of insulation in between the parties, and you find yourself in a situation of contracting with the person that you're going to work with. The whole process sets the table of the relationship going forward. And I would encourage everybody to know that the contracting is really a means to an end. We need to practice professional tolerance and respect even in the heat of battle. And ultimately, we need to keep our focus on the relationship and the service offering. And throughout the entire process, certainly we want equal transparency from both sides on the goals and the issues. Now, being from Michigan, I have a lot of a lot of contact with the auto industry, and I just wanted to share a GM union worker quote that I heard. And that is, during the good times, we take, and during the bad times, we give. And unfortunately, I've seen a number of radiology groups take that same approach towards their relationships with their hospitals, and to which I would just say we want to take a look where GM is now. And another thing I see within the groups is there's a sense that this could never happen to me. I'm offering a very important service, and I would say that largely that's true. But if we look at the changing times and the fact that General Motors, what once was the largest corporation in the world, is now in the situation it is, bad things can certainly happen to our radiology groups as well. So to summarize the takeaways from this portion of the presentation, this changing environment that we're in has created a need for a paradigm shift, not a new model. The group practice model offers many advantages that must be relayed to the hospital and the non-physician leaders. We all need to understand this. Group leadership is charged with navigating these waters, becoming a service-centered business entity. Great clinical work will get you at the table, but great service will keep you at the table. And given the environmental change and the pace at which things are changing, there is urgency for this shift right now. So with that, I would like to close my portion of the presentation and turn it over to my colleague, George Earhart. George?
Thanks, Randy. And as Randy said, a big part of what we're going to focus on as we go through a few strategies for success, both from the hospital and the physician side, are going to center around general business principles and market-focused solutions. Very few of the items we're going to discuss are going to necessarily be new. As was mentioned in the introduction, though, we work with about 1,700 radiologists around the country, and we continue to see many of the same shortcomings in many practices in terms of their negotiations and their relationships that they've built and are trying to maintain in hospitals. So this is an area that is discussed in many training sessions, both that are conducted online as well as at training put on by RBMA or by other professional organizations. So it's an area that can bear touching on once again, we think. Obviously, working together in a collaborative process is going to be, again, the theme that we focus on, and that is really geared towards achieving success of both the hospital and the radiology group. The two groups are, as people on this call certainly know, are clearly codependent in their imaging business. It is not necessarily, and we've seen many groups go into a negotiation strategy posture of feeling like they need to crush their opponent. That is typically not worked out to be the best. It may be great fun for the short term, but it typically does not yield the best long-term relationships. And at the end of this, we're going to give a couple examples of both good and bad relationships before we get to some of the questions. Obviously, the first step for any practice is to do an honest and complete self-assessment of the relationship as it currently stands and where it needs to be improved. We don't want to overshoot the fact that we've got people on this call that are in practices that have got this process working perfectly. In those cases, it's a matter of refining the relationship. In many other practices, though, we're actually in a situation where they are actually in more of an overhaul perspective. So looking at collaborative strategies and this is, again, trying to take the view from the hospital's perspective of some things that groups may be able to encourage a hospital to help with. For people on the hospital side of the world, that wanted to touch on some of the reasons why these things may make sense. Providing recruitment assistance is an area where many hospitals and groups work together. It's obviously, on the face of it, helps out financially, but it is not necessarily just about the money in practices where this has worked successfully. It's really more about building the profile of the physician service model that fits the strategies of the hospital as well as the physician group. So that's an area that can certainly help. Operational concerns within the department. These are frequently areas, whether they are in areas of scheduling or PAC system or techs and coverage. These are areas where one or both of the parties know that there are issues or challenges. They are not typically going to go away on their own, so we encourage our practices to wrestle these to the ground as quickly as possible because they typically build and become more of a problem as they go forward. Joint venture opportunities has been a big area for practices and hospitals to work together in the past. The opportunities are not quite as great in the outpatient market there as they might have been in the past, but there are still opportunities for the two entities to work together in many cases, and it does tend to build a stronger relationship. To the extent you've got expertise in the radiology department, you need to obviously take advantage of that. It's important to know the actual market, what the referring physicians and the actual patients are looking for in the market while you're trying to build a collaborative group working on imaging services. There are instances where hospitals actually end up helping to pay for services, whether it is Nighthawk coverage because they've got remote locations or they have other needs that need to be covered that are creating a strain within the group. And again, coming back to the co-objective of providing the strongest clinical base, anything that the two groups can work towards in terms of helping support the financial model of the actual practice is helpful. Turf battles, this is, again, nothing new, but these continue to fester in some of the relationships we've seen. Those typically are not going to go away. It's helpful to try to at least understand where there is going to be a division currently and where there's likely to be further erosion from the radiology practices side in the future. There actually is information out that shows that just from back when the interventional shift really began to take hold back in the 86 to 98 time frame, so about a 12-year time frame, the radiologist share of imaging workload based on RVUs actually went from approximately 79% down to 58%. Not surprisingly, cardiology at the same time went up from 5 to 25%. Anyone that's been in practice through that time frame certainly lived through that and is familiar with it. You have to understand that the hospital actually has reasons, though, for needing to divvy up the services in some cases, and it is not all going to end up on the radiologist side. There are areas that continues to be a challenge currently, such as peripheral vascular services and cardiac MRI. So turf battles need to be acknowledged and hopefully addressed up front. From a radiology group's perspective, the overall theme, again, is going to be to add market value, and there's a number of ways that groups can do this. Looking critically at the actual integration within the imaging department. Again, customer-focused service, top to bottom, is going to be key to this from the hospital's perspective in terms of how successful a group is performing. That is both the internal clients or customers, the clinicians, referring docs, and so forth, as well as the actual patient-facing relationships that the radiology group has. Again, nothing new there, I don't think, but is something that some groups struggle with, and it is frequently a point of contention. Need to develop a communication strategy within the network. That should not be something that, and we'll talk a little bit more about contracting later, but it should not be something that is sort of a on-off switch. It should be an ongoing process and a matter of open and clear communication of what's going on. In an ideal relationship, we realize that does not necessarily always happen, but to the extent that you get to the point where you have a good relationship with the center, it should be able to be achievable. All of these lead to the point where hopefully the group begins to gain market leadership and becomes a known quantity in the market. If you're lucky enough to be in a group where you've achieved this, you know that you're the group that everyone in town knows who they are, how they provide services, and how good they are to work with. If you're not lucky enough to be in one of those groups, then presumably you probably have been in a practice location or in another area or talking with some of your peers, you realize that for other groups it does work, and it helps build the practice strength over time to a large degree. Just go back again to the customer service side of the business. One of Larry Muroff, who I'm sure many of you all have heard speak, has for the last several years emphasized that most referring physicians, this is a quote from Larry, most referring physicians would rather get superior service from average radiologists than lousy service from great radiologists. And that's hard for people that are focused on the clinical side of the business and the excellence in terms of recruiting and getting the right physicians on the bus. From a clinical standpoint, have to realize that the customer service side is important as well. Continuing on collaborative strategies and things that the group can do to help with that. They need to continue to grow the practice. Hold on, back up one slide. Through a couple means, actually working on an actual outpatient and system strategy rather than just being carried along by the current. Using service execution, again, trying to be the best at providing service as a growth strategy, and it does work. That's the people that others are looking to bring into their practices, so it is very helpful with our groups that are looking to grow their business. Diversifying and finding new sources of revenue and growing the distributed reading business. Obviously, finding new sources of revenue is a challenge. There are a lot of people out there competing for every bit of revenue. It is not always going to be the easiest or the best revenue, but the constant exploration and openness in this area is critical to groups that want to continue to grow and diversify their revenue base. A distributed reading business, we're not necessarily talking about going into the business of competing with Nighthawk here as much as using distributed reading to leverage the resources within a practice, again, to be able to better serve the clinicians and the patients. We've seen a number of practices where they have truly mastered this just within their own organization, and it is quite a thing to see when it's working well. It helps both the physicians as well as the actual patient flow. So it works very well. Planning workforce and physician management and recruitment. Again, doing this in conjunction with the hospital is important. In our experience, many times it is important to recognize that there are two groups of physicians that you may be recruiting into a practice. There are going to be people that are more partner-oriented and will view themselves as an integral part of the business and the management of your practice and take everything that's happening in your practice to heart. And then there are going to be some that are going to look at it more as an employee relationship. It's going to be in a medium to large size group. It's going to be hard in our experience to get everyone on board that has the same partner entrepreneurial spirit, simply because there are going to be times when the clinical needs are going to override necessarily that strength in some of your recruits. But it's important to recognize that you've got to have a core group of people inside the practice that manage the business as though it were their own and care about it to that degree. Planning for growth within the hospital or the hospital system and financial security or upside risk or loss come down to planning and communication. One of the greatest weaknesses we see in our practices is failure to plan. To the extent we can, we try to help practices with that, but planning for eventualities that can be foreseen, both good and bad, is a key to groups being prepared to actually be able to deal with them when they come to fruition. Again, operating in a business-like manner is a theme that you probably see throughout this. You want to develop a market and imaging value brand. Again, we're not necessarily talking about slicks and flyers and coffee mugs that are being handed out as much as the expectation of the service that a clinician or hospital is going to get from your practice. Customer service and management has to be a focus at all times. Productivity, we have seen just over we do an internal survey of a lot of productivity measures across all of our groups, and we have seen a dramatic shift in productivity over the last 10 to 12 years. I'm sure everyone that's a radiologist on this call is feeling that. We know a lot of people have the sense that they're doing a lot more for a lot less, but the interesting thing is both through technology and improved workflow, as well as different work approaches by physicians, they really are doing a lot more, and that is one of the things that help offset a little bit of the physician shortage across the market, as well as to help groups continue to grow. A couple other, again, approaching your practice like as though it were the business that it is critical to its success. Contracts that actually reflect what's going on in the market and payer strategies are key. Bad payer agreements will crush a practice faster than almost anything that we see from all of our groups. When we are lucky enough to have a group that has fostered the ideal relationship, some of the outcomes of that are listed on this slide. The two parties are working together in terms of delivering the actual services. It's working good financially for both parties. The hospital, as most of you know, the imaging is a significant portion of most hospital systems' revenue, and it usually is a disproportionate percentage of their actual margin. So imaging services are key to a key part of the lifeblood of a facility. So they, again, two groups are pretty codependent. Radiologists want as much and as good of imaging services as they can have. Hospitals want to have that as well. You can get, with a good relationship, it's a lot easier to deal with turf issues, where it's not just a one-sided argument that you want the turf. There's actually a reason for why you can actually provide better services. So all of these things, when they actually are working together, it is, as we say, it is just a beautiful thing to see. We have a lot of practices that have succeeded in doing this, but it is a matter of constant and ongoing care and feeding of the relationship, if you will. There's really no silver bullet. It's just a lot of work. Failure to actually invest the time in the relationship between the two typically yields some short-term savings in terms of time and a drain on the emotional resources of a group, but long-term it does not lead to the best relationship and the ongoing strength of the actual practice. Just a couple quick examples of one or two groups where we've seen this work ideally and not so. We have one practice where we actually they were on the cusp of pulling out of Blue Cross, and as all of you know, Blue Cross is a pretty big portion of almost any practice's payer mix. It was a contract issue where the Blues were essentially asking for about a 15 to 18% fee cut. They had negotiated as much as they could on their own. The Blue was exercising their leverage. It was a market where they actually had an even larger than normal share of the patients, and the key factor that the day before they were going to have to be pulling out of the network, and they had been communicating. The key again is communication. They had communicated this with their hospital administration from the beginning of the negotiations when they saw that this could potentially become an issue. The CEO of the hospital actually called up the Blue Cross, as they put it, the top dogs, and explained how important it was that they continue to be reimbursed as they were, and that they had to have this radiology group in their practice or in the center to continue the success of taking care of Blues patients. And they got a call that day, and essentially the contract was re-executed at the current rates. The other side of the coin, we've got another practice where they work in two facilities that had common ownership. New owner came in and bought both of them. One of the facilities was the acknowledged dog of the two, but both clinically, demographically, the equipment, it was not the ideal place to work, but it was a key part of the system. New owner buys both. The group had a lot of it started out as suggestions, became demands for upgrades and improvements to the lesser locations, not to mention they were making noises about some financial assistance. All of the requests were reasonable. The delivery came from, as Randy talked about earlier, the message was not clear and concise from one point. It came from a lot of people. The delivery was awful. It eventually degraded into threats of having to look at whether they could continue to cover that site. Not surprisingly, shortly after that, they were invited within the terms of their agreement, which was up for renewal, not to continue to cover that site. The group had internally presented that they were going to be fine with taking a 30 to 35% pay cut and just taking a lot more vacation. Turns out that there was one fellowship-trained physician in the group that they had actively recruited and felt was key to the practice that was apparently not on board with that. So they lost a lot of revenue. They do have a lot of time off now, but they put their core operation at risk as well, which they've managed to hang on to, and I think we're helping them improve their relationship there. But it was rocky for a bit. So again, ideal relationships, they work great. When they're not taken care of properly, they can go horribly wrong. We're actually going to distribute this presentation. Is going to be available online for people to retrieve. I think you're going to get instructions out for that. We've got some included in this. There are a couple references as well as some additional reading that's attached here as well. And we had one other question that I think may have been asked by a couple people, which was whether this was going to qualify for CME. This is not a registered CME course. And with that, as we mentioned earlier, we've got a fair bit of time. We want to make sure we had a few minutes at the end for 15 or so minutes of questions and answers. So to go ahead and start, if you've got questions, you can continue to put those in now, and we'll answer those. And we're going to go ahead and answer a couple of these as well.
Okay. George, before we get started, as you maybe take a look at the questions there, I just wanted to share with the group that at the this whole topic got a fair, much more than a fair amount of conversation and deliberation at the recent Radiology Business Management Association strategic planning session. I think this topic is certainly forefront on everyone's minds right now. And there were just a few themes that went through the discussions that I wanted to share. And it seemed like one of the biggies is that we as groups really have to keep our group politics to ourselves. We can't operate in the hospital environment and have mixed messages or partners voicing dissension or disagreement. We really need to service the customer with a united front, and that seemed to be a fairly significant theme. The second dealt with a subject that we all find extremely difficult, and that is how to discipline or how to curb disruptive physicians. Again, there were a number of, there was information, dialogue held, but obviously these situations are pretty pertinent to a specific group, specific instance. And finally, and I say it somewhat facetiously, but it was something that went around, and that is the saying that fat cats don't hunt. I think that we as an industry really need to wake up, or to not wake up so much, but to recognize that we are in a different competitive environment, and that while we may have had a certain degree of comfort up to this point, that we need to be aware that we need to be much more aggressive going forward. So I just wanted to share those while you had a chance to look at some of those questions. George?
Let's see, we've got several, and we'll go through as many of these as we can. If we don't get to yours, please don't take it personally. We will, as I think was said in the introduction, we will email. We've got the ability to email answers after this. Our email is on the screen as we go through these. Please put in any additional questions that you have as we walk through some of these, but you're also welcome to email either Randy or myself at the addresses shown there. We've got one question here. Have we seen groups engage intermediaries to negotiate contracts with hospitals? Another, we're asked if there's an advantage to having a third-party facilitator versus a group negotiate on its own. That is, in our experience, that depends heavily on how the relationship is. We can certainly tell you that having the wrong people engaged to negotiate the contract is never helpful. To the extent that, again, let's come back to the fact that in an ideal world, in that we see a lot of groups that fall into this trap. They view the negotiation and a hospital contract as a very short time frame event that may occur every, hopefully not every year, but every 2 to 5 years that is an event. It should ideally be an ongoing process of developing the expectations and managing what the actual needs of both the practice as well as the hospital are. We understand that you're going to get to some point where you're actually going to have to sit down and work through the details of the written agreement. At that point, what we found to be most successful is if the group has worked up to that properly, then there's going to be one or more physicians in the group that have, hopefully in a leadership role in the group, that have a good relationship with the hospital administration, the key hospital administrators, or their attorney or whomever is going to be representing the hospital side. The advantage you have from having an outside person is to sort of help steer the process, to work through a more finite agenda, to be able to bring some expertise or some experience from outside of just your practice and your hospital's relationship. We're able to do that in a lot of cases, and it's very helpful just from a perspective standpoint. It's not critical. It's not critical. It's not necessary that you have somebody from outside, but it is frequently very helpful. We typically do not advise groups. If you start out with 2 attorneys at a table, it tends to drift on. And if there are attorneys on the call, I apologize in advance. But it tends to drift on for a lot of discussion of the legal language without necessarily a full understanding of what the actual business needs of the 2 parties are. There are legal issues that have to be addressed, and it's important to have, to the extent you've got counsel on both sides that need to know those items going as you go through the process. It's helpful, but in our experience, having 2 attorneys hash out the agreement between 2 business parties is not the best choice. To the extent it's somebody, like, it sounds like I'm putting in MMP plugs left and right, but to the extent it's somebody like us that has a lot of experience in the area, then yes, it can be very helpful and help sort of have somebody there to temper any flare-ups as well. Randy, you have one you want to get?
The next question is, hospitals are increasingly requiring benchmarks in performance, for example, turnaround times. Where can we find reasonable national benchmarks to use as a foundation? This topic as well got a lot of play at the Radiology Business Management, SPS. And quite frankly, we are at somewhat of a disadvantage as an industry because we have not established the metrics and these types of national benchmarks to be used, and that information is something that everybody seems to be crying for, and so I guess to that I would say we are not aware of any great sources of that information right now, but we are very confident that they are in development. And to the extent that you can, we would encourage you to, go ahead and take some time and complete the surveys and help define these benchmarks and build this base of information. As with anything, it takes a little bit of work, certainly, but it is information that we certainly need to develop as an industry. Counter to that, I would point out that I'm sure that there are certain benchmarks and metrics that the hospital side is developing as well. And as we've talked throughout this whole conversation, to the extent that we can develop those metrics collaboratively with the hospital and avoid a situation of where, you present your data, I present my data, and the 2 may conflict with one another. To the extent we can work together on this, the better.
Okay, here is one. Again, I think you may find that the theme is going to be similar, but radiologists seem to be a quote target for many administrators in terms of compensation as well as what their actual workload is or what sort of actual physician practice they're providing. How would you address this comment? If this, again, I think comes back to the process of establishing the expectation that the services provided by the radiologist are critical to the internal operation of the hospital. And we're not naive. We understand there are some relationships that just feel like they're going to be virtually impossible to turn around, where the physicians or the physician group may actually be, they may have a negative connotation, either through no fault of their own or from the history of the practice. There's a long memory in a lot of facilities, as well as in a lot of practices for what's happened in the past. But if a group feels like they are actually being targeted and they don't get, I think the tone of this question is they don't really get the respect that they deserve, and rightfully so, both clinically as well as professionally. Then I think we would say that you've really got to look at how you've gotten to that point in the relationship with the administration. You're going to have to find ways to help demonstrate the expertise that the group has, as well as their focus on client service, customer service for the facility and its patients. You may not be able to. In most cases, you're not going to be able to just come up with a list of 6 things that you do to achieve that. The best recommendation that I would give a group, if I was counseling them on this, is the best place to start is going to be to go talk with the administration and to find out what it is that they think that we should be doing differently, and how we can help them out. Once you start actually trying to help them with their problems in the imaging arena, typically that will lead to a better understanding of what need shortfalls you've had in the past. Randy, do you have another?
Yeah, I do. Question came in that said, are there any guidelines for practice self-assessment? And to that, I would say that there are a number of consultant organizations out there, radiology specific, that can assist with that. And this kind of ties back to the metrics question. How do we measure ourselves? How do we assess ourselves? So I'll throw back to my previous answer, which is while we are developing as an industry some of these metrics, I think that there are consultant organizations out there that through their work have begun preliminarily gathering these types of metrics based on what they've seen. So there may be an opportunity to work with some of those organizations and define some of these metrics for self-assessment. And in this instance, particularly when it comes to relationship, which tends to be a little more of an emotional as opposed to objective review, having a third party involved might make some sense. So, George?
We've got time for one more, and I know there are probably 3 or 4 more still left out here. Like I said, we'll certainly email individually for the folks that sent those in, but we've got one question. Actually, a couple people have asked along the same themes of what leverage, if any, do contracted groups have with their hospital administrators while negotiating contract? Is there any circumstance where a group can decide not to go along with the hospital administrator with what they want and expect to retain their contract? This would illustrate that, well, first of all, if you've already got a contract, then the good news is you're in now. You've had the opportunity to build a good expectation of service, a good relationship with the administration and with your peer group within the hospital. So that if things have gone well, you should be to your advantage. There's nothing easier than negotiating a contract on behalf of a group where everyone in the hospital loves them and will, the sense is that they will go, that they will fight on their behalf even though they're not in their practice. where you've got groups that nobody knows or cares about what they're doing, those are not quite as enjoyable to work on, through the negotiation process on. I'm not sure that the portion with regard to expecting to retain your contract, that it just illustrates that it is critical that groups understand exactly what is in their current agreements before they go into any negotiations or discussions. I mean, let's call it discussions, because theoretically it should be a discussion before you actually get to where you're hashing out the verb and noun agreement within the actual agreement. The contract that you've got currently is key. It probably doesn't go on forever, especially if you're working in a hospital that has ever had any, is a nonprofit or has any sort of a bond funding. There's going to be restrictions on how long-term their agreements can actually be for any service. So understand what your current agreement has in it, both with regard to scope as well as term, before you actually sit down for the initial discussions. Typically, they are not indefinite agreements. That's also the time to understand what if with regard to exclusivity or having rights of first refusal on new practice locations, how those are structured. That again is an important facet of the negotiation process. It's important to understand who you're contracting with, and I don't want to drift too far into contracting because it's not really the focus of this discussion, but just from what we've seen in many cases, it's important to understand who you're contracting with from a legal standpoint versus who you actually envision that you're working with. In other words, you may have a contract with an individual hospital rather than the parent hospital organization. You may have an exclusivity or a right of first refusal provision in that does not extend to that whole hospital system. So again, that's more of a nuance of contracting, but we've actually seen instances recently where the parent system opens up a new location. The group thinks they're going to be the slam dunk answer to be able to staff that, and as it turns out, the hospital actually has other plans in place, and there's really no legal leg to stand on for the practice. So with that, Randy, did you have any other closing comments before we wrap this up?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, thanks again for everyone joining us. We've got, again, our emails there. If you have any other questions that you haven't submitted already, feel free to email us. We'll get them back to you. We appreciate everybody's time in walking through this material. We think it's important to practices to continue to keep their hospital relationships healthy. Thanks, and everyone have a great afternoon.